actually met with NBS, and they actually have even newer information that's not so much based upon the change in the law, though he will talk about that, but about some recent changes in how PBID have been implemented that were not something that we were aware of, which I think may be very pertinent to this task force discussion. So this is Tim Seufert. He's a managing. Well, you weren't any of that when we first met.
Yes.
You're now a managing director. Or an intern.
Okay, director.
We actually found a flyer with him 20 years ago. When he was like a junior staffer or something.
Well, good morning, everybody. I just wanted to give kind of a little brief overview of things going on with the law and sort of practices and that kind of thing. But just to back up, just make sure everybody's on the same page. We're talking about the PBID law, which is the 94 Act, right? Which allows what you've been doing for many years here is to assess property for special benefit to provide these services. And a PBID does everything from clean and safe to marketing, economic development. You go to Union Square in San Francisco, they have the guides running around. This doing transit is actually, as far as I know, it's the only one in California. There is one in Denver, there's some other places that do, but so it's a unique thing. I've always found it very interesting to talk about with people, and a lot of folks have looked at it, but they've never actually pulled the trigger, if you will, in other cities. So anyways, so it's a 94 Act. One of the things that people don't know of, well, there's an 89 Act, which is business-based assessments. So in other words, not property, but actually on business licenses. But the 94 Act, the one that we're using right now, allows you to do property or business or both. So just kind of something to think about in the future, and I'll talk about some in a minute. So that's the law that we're using, the enabling statute, if you will. It's the same one that San Francisco uses for all the CBDs over there, community benefit districts. To renew at this point, you can renew for up to 10 years is the standard. So if we started today, you can renew for 10 more years. Generally, I recommend about a year process to do renewal. Some of you have been here a long time, right? Recall we formed this thing in months, and I would never recommend that again. You really need time to go through things, and one of the developments that Karen was alluding to is that the procedures and the legal rigor on these districts has definitely elevated in the last 5 years, quite a bit. In some respects, assessments have been on the ropes a little bit with the courts. We're still forming assessment districts all over, but instead of report this thick, it's this thick. You have a lot more objective data, a lot more analysis. Unfortunately, goes into these things. So that's probably the first thing, is that legal rigor is difficult. And I'm not a lawyer, but basically Prop 218, which was passed some years ago, is a constitutional thing. So that's why the courts are looking at it more carefully than they used to be back in the good old days, if you will. So that's important. There were a couple of PBIDs overturned in Los Angeles, if you read the papers, so for various legal reasons. So again, that's all part of the legal rigor. The other is, one thing I do want to mention is, it's not uncommon now to assess residential property. Again, you see that a lot in San Francisco. You're seeing it in certain places in LA and even in Oakland here. It used to be thought you'd never assess residential. If you're providing security services that go right down the street, how can you distinguish between a business type property and a residential if they're both getting services from security, for example, right? It's kind of the typical example I use. Bonding is allowed, and it's actually been allowed for a few years. It's actually called out in the statute, where in other words, you could issue a $1 million bond and use your assessments to pay back that bond. Obviously, if you've already got a little bit of a deficit, you don't have a lot of extra cash flow around to bond against, right? But it is called out. Smart financial advisors and underwriters have always been able to figure out a way to bond against any stream of money. But if you do use the code, which allows 1915 Act bonds and Marx Rus bonds, if you're into some of the terminology there, you could actually increase the length of your district remember I talked about a 10-year renewal? If you had to do a 20-year bond, you can actually do a 20-year renewal. These laws were put on the books, they really haven't been used much at all. They were put on the books for Sacramento when they were trying to redo the Arco Stadium or whatever a few years ago. And it actually never worked politically, and you probably watched some of the other stuff that's gone on out there, so it's been interesting. One legal thing, just recently there was Senate Bill 184, which made some really minor changes to the language, but it took out this weird line that was in there about a categorical exemption. Property that was otherwise not accessible could be just exempted. It doesn't make any sense. If you've got, you know, a public building, again, that's getting all that security services, you can't just exempt them. Anybody who gets services or benefit has to be assessed. Kind of comes back to that, you know, that residential discussion that we were talking about. So, long story short is, given that you've got, you know, a deficit, a looming issue going on, I would say, you know, renew sooner than later. If you start today, you know, in theory you could have new assessments in a year. You know, renew for 10 years unless there's consideration of bonding to, you know, buy property or buy buses or something like that. One of the things I mentioned a minute ago to consider, and again, there's many ways to slice this, but if you renewed at your, you know, $2.7, $2.8 million, but you wanted to get an extra few $100,000 and you wanted to have that targeted to certain areas, maybe you layer in a business-based assessment as well. And I know this is a political discussion that we'll have to have a lot of talk about, but that's an idea, you know, to layer on that, and maybe, you know, Bay Street, you know, is a little zone and they want a certain service, so, you know, they pay a little bit extra, or whatever it might be. That's something to consider. You know, there are parcel tax type mechanisms, CFDs, but those are, you know, those have different voting requirements and things, but that could be an option to just do a certain special tax on business only, not residential. There's some voting requirements there that are kind of weird. And then, you're already kind of doing this, but contract for services as well. Let's say, again, I'm picking on Bay Street, but let's say, you know, Bay Street people say they want this service and they want it every year for the next 5 years, and they're willing to sign a contract. That's outside of the assessment. You know, so you get $100,000 a year from them over and above because they want, you know, this bell or whistle or whatever. So that would go, you know, outside of that, obviously. The reason I mention it is the flexibility. Once we lock down an assessment formula, you know, and everybody renews for 10 years, that's it. You know, we're not changing that formula for 10 years without a vote. You know, you can't just go in and change things 2 years into it without having to go completely back out and ballot the property owners and go through all that process. I guess the only thing I was going to mention is for the renewal. Again, this is procedural stuff. We have to go through, you know, of the ballot proceeding again, and it's a 50% plus one, in theory, protest ballot, right? So ballots are mailed to the property owners, and you wait to see what ballots get returned. You don't have to have 50% of what you send out, you know, to get approved. So if you mail out 100 ballots and you get 3 back, and 2 say yes, you're good. If 2 say no, you cannot proceed with the renewal.
But real quick, Tim, but it's weighted.
It's weighted, yeah, I'm simplifying, but yeah, it is weighted, so yeah, by dollar amount. So yeah, $1, 1 vote, you know, if you will, versus 1 person, 1 vote. So I think I covered most of the sort of highlights, if you will, just as an update. But
I think there's probably questions here. There's maybe some things that people here don't, I might put out there based upon our discussion, but Laura.
So if you do a contract on top of the PBID, they're still required to pay the PBID assessment. They just pay extra for extra service, right?
Correct, yeah. Because once you make these lines because of the special benefit to the properties, then they're locked into that. Right. Yeah, exactly.
So if I can, there has been, one of the issues has been sort of this, some groups of businesses feel that they're not getting as much benefit from the PBID as some of the larger.
Mm-hmm.
Would you recommend doing the contract or changing the basic assessments for each of the businesses?
We could look at, we could look at both. Unfortunately, these things have become like the tax code, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of maneuvering and winners and losers and all that kind of stuff. But you could look at maybe some zones. I think everybody likes to keep it simple.
Right.
And I would definitely advocate for that, but you might have a couple of zones, like again, Bay Street, maybe that the concentration of businesses, maybe there's a reason why they get, a penny more per square foot than, along San Pablo, or, whatever it might be.
Yeah, and that's,
Yes?
There has been some discussion about a prohibition against adjusting any assessment formula during the term of an approved P-bid. Because you're locked into a fixed assessment for fixed properties over a fixed period of time. But conditions change, and the routes and needs will grow and shrink in different parts of the city. Is there any possibility of changing assessments as buildings change use, as buildings are built, as those sorts of things happen during the term of a district?
Well, without sounding too technical, basically you approve a maximum assessment, and it's X cents per square foot. So if you add 100,000 square feet on a piece of empty property, then by definition, their assessment will go up, right? But you
Related
can't,
to a change of use, but not changing the district?
it's because of, the property owners, voluntary change in their property to increase their square
So it's a
footage.
condition of approval for a development that is the hook?
It's not really a condition of approval. I mean, if you build it, it's there, you know what I mean?
So it automatically changes?
When we formed the assessment, it was on every property in Emeryville, right? So if you had a vacant lot that you build a building on, then therefore your assessment is
Or
going
if
to
you
go
had a
up.
warehouse and then you turned it into office space, that's a change in land use.
So it's self-executing?
Once a year, we evaluate the different parcels and
Mhm.
develop the levy. And so once a year, we assess, is there a new floor put on that building? And therefore, there would be additional assessment to that property owner. Or has something been torn down, then that wouldn't be assessed anymore. Once a year, that analysis is
I
done.
think
Yeah, so
one
there
of
are
the
those
things-
annual, go ahead.
One of the things he's probably interested in, does the assessment ever go down during the summer?
well, I think
I don't-
you just answered.
For example, when Sherwin-Williams is demolished, there will
Yeah.
be nothing to assess on that site.
So it works both ways.
So you can go up to these maximums, you just can't change the maximum. I wasn't sure if that was your question. If it's 10 cents a square foot for the next 10 years, then it's 10 cents, you can't go over.
But it changes from 10 cents a square foot if you build on a vacant lot, doesn't it?
Well, so if your vacant lot then has 100,000 square feet on it, then you're paying the 10 cents on the 100,000.
You don't have
square feet.
different rates for different uses?
They do, warehouse,
some, yeah.
industrial, yeah.
Vacant lot's a different use from an office building.
Correct.
So
But
if you
vacant
build
use
an
is
office
zero.
building, do you automatically get to tax or assess that property as an office building?
Yes, you do.
Yes, on the
It's a
next
change.
round.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes.
Because it's
Yeah.
on structural square foot, so a vacant lot has 0 structural square foot. So the assessment there's a lien on the property, but the assessment is 0. As soon as you build on that vacant lot, it's based upon the land use the structural square foot that you built. So if you built a warehouse, it would be assessed at the warehouse rate. If you built an office or retail, it would be assessed at that rate.
I think there are
Yeah,
three
there's been-
classifications, right? There's commercial, industrial, and residential.
Yes.
And that depends.
No, there are three.
Okay. So Karen's example of the warehouse to an office would be a good example. That'd be from an industrial to a commercial use, and there is a different rate for that.
And it would double, and assuming the same square footage, that would double the rate, because warehouse industrial in the current P-bid is established at half of what the commercial retail rate is.
So I think everybody here wants to make sure that we have fairness built
Indeed.
into the PBID process. And I think with what you brought in, we can add a little layer of fairness that's going to help out.
Well, yeah,
Long-term
fairness, equity,
stability.
Yes.
and objective
Good point.
criteria.
Predictability.
That's really,
So if you
Yes.
include
Stability
residential, you would
comes
just
from-
send it out to literally all of the parcels in Emeryville, everybody within a certain distance from the Emery property.
if that's what makes sense, then yeah, that's
And
what
then they
we
would
do.
it would be a mail-in vote the same thing, it would be done exactly the same way, except it would just include different additional parcels.
Well, except for those that are in rental housing, it's still it's the property, under a PBID, it's the property owner who gets the bill.
Right.
Or I suppose you could layer in the business license. So a resident in a rental property would not be voting on this. It would be, either
Their
the
business,
property
yeah.
owner as the parcel owner, or the property owner because they're the one paying a landlord business license, right?
But people in
And
condos or in rental
condos
homes
would be getting, right,
eligible.
they would each get a ballot, so to speak, in which it would say, based upon whatever criteria, it could be per unit, it could be per bedrooms, it could be per square foot. Obviously, some of those are a little bit more straightforward and easy than others to do. And, that's obviously as much of a political question as it is a objective engineering question on, how do you determine that? I mean, right now, it's the same per unit regardless of anything else.
It's just a unit cost.
It's just a unit cost. And there's reasons that, I think, your experience is that that's oftentimes the case, that once you start getting more complicated than that, then
Is it an enforceability problem? If you go bedroom hook rather than unit hook, is that the problem? It's unenforceable because you don't know what they are?
No, we do know what it is. Every structure is listed by bedroom in the planning department.
I mean,
There's an
theoretically.
administrative issue, let's be honest.
Yeah.
It's hard to administer it now,
Too much headache.
right?
That's a
Let's
good
be honest.
argument. That's a
So
good
making it
argument.
more complicated won't make it easier to administer.
Yeah.
You wanna have equity that's administrable,
Yeah.
You don't want 10 million people saying you built me wrong,
Yeah, no, I don't.
or 8,000, or I don't know. But
any other questions?
Helpful.
I had a question. You recommend starting a year in advance, but you made it also sound like you could put in a new program earlier than the expiry of the existing, or not?
No, I don't know, I hope I didn't.
Okay,
I
maybe
think you could do
some-
contract for services, I mean, you can do that, right? as soon as
Oh, we're
you-
already doing that.
Yeah,
So, but so this expires calendar year end 16,
mhm.
right? So you say the earlier, there's nothing we could start it now, or we could start it, in your mind, would be a mistake to start it any later than
Correct.
the end of this year. I mean, right?
Yes,
Yeah,
right.
the end of this year.
So
I mean, sooner the better, especially with the deficit and some of these questions, it seems like put it all on the table and.
So the question would be, so right now, the current PBID, the last assessment is fiscal year 15-16, which is service year 16. So the last time would be put on the property rolls as fiscal year 15-16. Right now, we're in 13-14, so we've kind of 2 more years of assessment and kind of 2.5 more years of service is the way to look at it, because I won't get into why, but
Yeah, we
it was
understand.
structured so that you could get through a whole calendar
Yeah.
year, even if the PB ended. And so I guess what I was hearing as part of Jeff's question was that if you, let's say, are going out to the voters next year, or putting it on the ballot for next year, that would be during fiscal year potentially 14-15. And so what would happen in terms of, would it have to be an effective date out? I mean, where would be the effective date of the renewal if you go out, let's say, next year, as opposed to going out in the middle of 15-16?
I don't think there's any legal reason why you can't, renew earlier. And if you get approval with another assessment that's earning $3 million a year, for example, I think you kick that in as soon as you could. So in other words, we would not do the final year assessment with the old, we would roll the new in. I think that would probably make sense. I mean, especially again, with the deficit and such, and getting ahead of that, you don't want to run out of cash reserves, so.
So that's just technically, I mean, I don't know, but, so it could be that under the old one, 15-16 could be 0.
Correct.
And then, but then under the new,
It
you
would
would.
start
the
15.
Yeah, the council has the, opportunity to levy the assessment or not, so they could just say, all right, the old one is done and the new one is here.
can the contracts that you mentioned for specific zones like Bay Street or something like that, can they be instituted on the current P-bid, or do you have to have that structure in the new P-bid?
As my understanding, I mean, it's a contract for services, you can do whatever you want today. You know, I mean, I don't see any reason to hold that back. You'd still have the assessments. This would be something that would be layered on top, that would be voluntary. It's got to work for them, so.
So that's another option.
I mean, right now, I mean, the TMA does contract with West Berkeley to administer their shuttle.
Well, no, what I was talking about, and maybe I used the wrong terms, you talked about zones of P-bid that you could have more flexibility in
Well, if we want to create new zones with different assessments, that would be through the renewal process, yeah.
All right.
If you just want to do a contract, a side contract, if you will, then you could certainly do that anytime.
And the contract for the P-bid assessment, not for.
No, for example, there was
Fee
a
for
time
service.
when, like, the evening service, the later night service first started. At first, it was one or two businesses saying, you know, we're high-tech, our folks are working until 9, we need night service. And so there was a contract to provide night service. It didn't stop everywhere, it just stopped at one or two buildings, and they paid a premium, so they contracted for that service. And then after a while, particularly as there was more high-tech in Emeryville, the TMA board said that between the regional retail, between many more office space or research space with later hours, it made sense to add that night service, so to speak, throughout the system. But it first started with a contract.
So isn't that the same thing with weekend service? I mean, couldn't that be sort of a contract, weekend service? I mean, that would address some of the things that the EPOA was talking about, I think, right? In other words, not all businesses are open on weekends.
You know, I think that's something for discussion. I think that some of that might be better addressed in the renewal, because then you start picking apart, well, you know, if I'm retail, maybe I get weekend service, but I don't get much service between 6 and 10.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
so I think I don't know if opening that up now, as opposed
Right.
to that being
Okay.
part of the discussion for the newer one, I think would probably make more sense, because I think
I agree with that.
there's quote, benefit, you know, people get more or less benefit during the day, just on the type of business that they are.
Well, we talked about that when we get the new study from here in Paris, that, you know, to my mind, it doesn't make sense linking commercial and retail. I think they're very different beasts. So, you know, but we won't know till we get the information from the study.
And one of the things I think is important is to, you want equity, but you don't want to create a system that discourages adoption,
Correct.
right? Like, I believe in general, this is a great transit addition, right? And we want to encourage ridership, not discourage it,
Yeah.
right? Because that's the problem with success. So you don't want to say, this neighborhood isn't using it now, so we're not going to serve it, and then they won't use it because there isn't the service. So that's why the board has sort of wanted to reinvest in the service, because it, you know, once passengers opt out,
You don't get them
they're
back.
not, they're very, it's much harder to get them back, because they just figure out a different way of traveling that, whatever that trip that they're taking is, so.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense to reduce service to meet your budget, because you
Yeah.
run into that.
But for example, as Lauren moves her business to West Oakland, if she could rally businesses to fund
Yeah, Lauren.
a service in West Oakland, and they signed a contract, because that's exactly kind of, West Berkeley was similar to that, you know? So
Yeah, yeah,
those are really good freestanding, because it's someone who doesn't have it, who says, I really want it.
yeah.
The people who have it, it's hard to say, other than little exploratory
Yeah,
things
I
like Karen
agree.
mentioned, which people have encouraged the Emery go-round to experiment, like we think their riders, it was the same with the car share. I mean, the Emery go-round subsidized car share to come to Emeryville, saying to the car share, we think there's a business here, and we're confident you'll find that there's a business that doesn't need a subsidy. We'll subsidize you long enough for you to figure that out. And they figured it out really quickly, you know? So that was another case of it wasn't so much as a contract, because the TMA said we want to And now they're running the business unsubsidized, other than people are giving them free parking, which is also a subsidy.
Right.
And that may fall away, but it's that kind of thing that you want, I think, to continue into the future.
But nothing's free. Somebody's paying for it.
Such thing as the free.
Okay, so anything on any of these other issues? Yes.